During World War I, young men signed up to go off on what they thought was the greatest adventure of their lifetime. Some of these men went off seeking inspiration to write stories of war, some went off seeking glory, and some went off because they felt as if it was their duty. Some of these men had never operated a weapon before, yet they were about to walk into the First Great War. Some of these men were swayed by the romanticized image of war and its glory, and some of these men would engage in the bloodiest American offensive to this day, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The Meuse-Argonne conflict, which is also known as the Meuse-Argonne conflict, or the Battle of the Argonne Forest. It was a major part of the final Allied offensive in Europe. This was the largest offensive in the history of the United States. It involved over 1.2 million troops and was also a part of the 100-Day Offensive. It was fought from September 26, 1918, until both the Allies and the Germans agreed to an armistice on November 11, 1918. This offensive was called the 100-Day Offensive because the initial plan of the offensive started on August 8, 1918. The Battle of the Argonne Forest did not happen until a later time period. The 100 Days Offensive does not cover any one specific battle, but it refers to the string of Allied victories against the Germans in that time period. The battle's initial strategy was planned by Colonel George Marshall. He specifically planned the attack on the Argonne Forest and coordinated the attack with many others on the Western Front. British and French soldiers contributed to the fighting, but their strategies did not go together with the Americans. Time and time again, French miscommunication and strategy left the Americans confused. Miscommunication during World War I is a very big issue, because a main form of communication was the carrier pigeon. Letters and plans were attached to the backs of pigeons, and they were trained to bring them to the other pigeon coops. This was a very unreliable form of communication. The entire offensive was under the command of John J. Pershing, and halfway through the offensive the command was switched. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the bloodiest offensive in the history of the U.S., but there is an even more tragic story within the offensive itself. During wartime, strategies and plans often go wrong. This event is the product of poor communication with the French Allies and poor strategic planning by the Americans. The Lost Battalion is the name given to about 9 companies that were separated from the main fighting force and were surrounded by the Germans. They were under the command of Major Charles Whittlesey. Major Whittlesey was a smart man. He attended Williams College and was dubbed the smartest man in class. He then entered into Harvard Law School and graduated in 1908. He served with the 77th Division, 308th Battalion, Headquarters Company. He made an excellent strategist and brought many good plans to the table. Whittlesey was renowned for being a courageous man and a just leader. He cared greatly about his men. Instead of viewing his soldiers as an asset or a tool to be used against the enemy, he saw them as living, breathing men with families back home, and he wanted to do everything he could to bring them back. The 77th Division was known as the Liberty Division because of its Statue of Liberty insignia that they had chosen for themselves. Most of the men in this division were from New York City, and they weren't used to being in this type of terrain. He became more well-known towards the fall of 1918. Whittlesey gained worldwide recognition on October 1918 when the companies of his battalion, which were part of a campaign against the Germans in the Argonne Forest, were cut off for several days without adequate supplies of food or ammunition. Though it was often blamed on Whittlesey's own overzealousness and inexperience, the troops of the 308th were left vulnerable to being surrounded by the enemy. Their own successful advance and the inability of Allied troops on the flanks to advance had left them in such a position. Major Whittlesey and his men came under fire by German troops on both sides of the ravine that they had entered. When the men were surrounded, there were 463 doughboys under his
Move it up on line! Move it up!
Thank God.
Move it up! Move it up! Come on! Let's go! Yeah! Let's go, everybody! Attack! Let's go! Forward! Boys! Come on, boys! Hang in, boys! Hang in there! Let's go! Keep going! Move forward! Down! Stop! Come on! Let's go!
Some troops from the 307th Infantry, under the command of Nelson Holderman, were also trapped with him. These men immediately needed to work together to alert the Allies of their location, all while holding off an attack from the Germans on both sides. The Americans held out valiantly against the German onslaught. Most of the 550 men who entered the battle had never been into combat and have never seen the enemy face to face. These men became hardened warriors faced with survival. As they were trapped into the ravine, troops began to die at the hand of the Germans. Food was running low and ammunition was scarce. The well-supplied Germans at the top of the ridgeline were mercilessly raining down upon the men. When the men were long foodless and almost wholly without ammunition, and when many were weak from exhaustion, but not one despairing, an American who had been taken prisoner by the Germans had suddenly appeared at the little camp surrounded by the valley. The man had been sent blindfolded from the German headquarters with a typewritten note to Major Whittlesey reading, "Americans, you are surrounded on all sides. Surrender in the name of humanity. You will be well treated." Major Whittlesey didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Go to hell," he almost shouted. Then he read the note to those around him and his men. Notwithstanding their weariness and hunger, and imminent danger of every moment, they cheered so loudly that the Germans heard from their observation posts. A direct frontal assault by German troops is not the only thing that the Americans had to worry about. The Germans were toying with the Americans. The American position was surrounded by snipers, and any soldier who attempted to get water or food was shot and killed. The Americans began to rely on a system of runners to deliver messages and to gather supplies. The runners under Whittlesey's command got a message to the Allied higher-ups to deliver artillery on the German position. Runners who were fast enough completed their missions. If the runners weren't quick enough, they were picked off by German snipers. Eventually, Whittlesey and his men attacked an abandoned mill to get out of the ravine. The troops rushed into a German ambush because they were too inexperienced to realize that it was a trap. The Americans and the Germans engaged in a harrowing firefight, but the Americans prevailed due to their artillery. Artillery was the beginning to another problem for the Allied troops, one that they did not see coming. The men pushed too far into the enemy position, and the artillery gunners misinterpreted the location of the soldiers. Major Whittlesey and his men were under a barrage of artillery fire from their own side, and all they could do was look on in horror.
Salesman, I love him. Attaboy! You honey bastards! Our guys are bombing us! Take cover! Catch your bags! Get under cover! When you go down the medical center, get the wounded all
Many
under
men were
cover.
killed
Go
before
right
the
now.
attack could be called off. Since the soldiers were trapped, there was only one way to reach the gunner's position: carrier pigeons. Whittlesey sent a carrier pigeon containing a message to stop the barrage, and that pigeon was shot down. He sent another. It made it over the bridge, but it was eventually shot down by another German soldier. He only had one carrier pigeon left, Cher Ami. Cher Ami was the carrier pigeon that managed to fly overhead and deliver the message to the Allies, all while navigating through heavy German fire. The message read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Bullets whizzed around Cher Ami, and the pigeon was eventually wounded, but began to fly again. The message was delivered and the lives of the troops were saved. Out of the 550 men who had entered with Whittlesey, only 194 soldiers remained at this point in the siege. The Allied bombardment had stopped. It did not kill the remaining men, thanks to a single carrier pigeon. The lost battalion did not go unnoticed. The Allies toiled away at the daunting task of finding these men. The airmen searched tirelessly for the lost battalion, but the pilots were unable to find the battalion. The men's outcries were drowned out by the German gunfire. The soldiers' only form of communication with the Allied forces through carrier pigeons and was highly unreliable. The men of the 77th were found after a firefight with the Germans, with only 194 remaining from the original 550. The other Allied forces were able to break through the German line, thanks to the ability of the 77th to hold their line against the German forces. Major Whittlesey was the only one to fully complete his mission in that sector, despite being doubted by all of his allies. Major Whittlesey received a Medal of Honor in Binerville after the fight. The portrayal of the 77th in the 77th Division in media was very accurate. This story became a sensation, with Major Whittlesey being hailed as a hero. The most famous portrayal of this event was in a movie called The Lost Battalion, which is directed by Russell McCaulley. It accurately shows the hardships that the men went through, as well as Whittlesey's own character. He became the subject of countless newspapers and war propaganda. He was viewed as a hero by the men of the 77th and other military personnel. The story of the Lost Battalion was told all over the country, and the exploits of the men were dramatized, and the stories were twisted. This battle became a subject of propaganda in the United States, and the 77th Division became a popular symbol for victory in the United States. The battle itself was given a heroic twist, making Whittlesey out to be a grand hero. Whittlesey commanded his men with skill and compassion, and he managed to save the lives of many men who believed they were doomed. Against all odds, he held his line and allowed for Allies to push further into the German line, eventually allowing for the destruction of the German line. Without the 77th heroic actions, the outcome of the war would be much different.